Good morning. This is Master Chief Thomas McAdams. I'm going to tell you about an incident that happened back in New Year's Eve, 1953, going into 1954. And behind me here is a chart of the entrance to the Yaquina Bay, Newport, Oregon. And over the years, things do change, and the entrance has changed quite a bit at the time. As you can see behind me, here's the jetties coming out. The jetties are approximately 300 yards, just a bit over 300 yards between the two jetties, so large ships could come into the harbor, and used to come in there. There'd be 2 or 3 ships in the harbor at a time loading lumber and logs. This story starts off at New Year's Eve around 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The bar was extremely rough. A storm was brewing, and there were 3 fishing vessels, crab boats, that were coming up from the south with their catch of crabs to come in across the bar. At this time here, this is recent, and the jetties now come out to the reef, and you can see the reef along here where the blue is, and that's the North Reef, and South Reef runs across this way with hidden rocks all through here where it breaks very, very big, 25, 30 feet high breakers, enough to tear a boat to pieces in one plunge. And a 10-foot breaker has the force of over 4,562 pounds per square foot. And New Year's Eve, as the 3 vessels were approaching, I was standing in a tower watch to relieve, so people could go extra time for New Year's Eve. So I took a watch to relieve one of the men so he could go home, and then I was going to be off at 4 o'clock and go home. We got the call around 3:30 that they would like to have a standby because the bar was breaking, and at that time the jetties only came out to about halfway out here, and so this was all open area with breakers coming across. These 3 fishing vessels were standing by out at the whistle buoy, which is here approximately 3 miles out to sea. As they were entering the whistle buoy area, one of the vessels called, and he said he had a broken oil line and he needed assistance immediately because the wind was blowing 25 to 35 miles an hour with higher gusts, and the seas were raising up. The swells were, at that time, were running 15 to 20 feet high. The bar was breaking, what we call spot breaking. There'd be a breaker over here and then a breaker over here, and they needed a standby boat. And so this is the idea. What happened with the jetties, only that, remember now, half that length coming on out, and we were standing by inside approximately about in here when that fishing boat called. And the first boat was taken out by the second-class boatswain, Giles Vanderhoof, and he took the first boat out because I was in the tower. I came down from the tower immediately, and I took out the second boat, which is a 36-foot motor lifeboat, 10 1/4 tons, 36 foot long, and it has what we call the forecastle up forward, and it's covered, and it's approximately about 13 foot long, and then there's a well deck that drops down to about 5 foot across in there with the fuel tanks underneath the deck, and then about 7 feet or better for the engine room, which is completely covered, and then back aft where the crew and the helmsman stands, and that's about 6 foot there with the towing hawser and everything there, and then it points back to the pointy stern on it and to what we call the lazarette where the steering is. So we have 36 foot, 9-inch vessel, 10 1/4 tons, and has a little spray shield up forward that you could bring up that would stop the spray and the main water from tumbling down on you and would separate it. And that's where we stand as I go into the story. So it's New Year's Eve, 1954. It's now getting dark. It's just after 4 o'clock or 1600 military time in the afternoon. The winds are up 35 to 40 knots. Seas are running 15 to 20 feet high and increasing, and 3 fishing vessels are approaching the whistle buoy 3 miles out and wants a standby to cross in with their catch. One boat, the 36-footer, Vanderhoof, is standing by the end of the jetties as I bring this second 36-foot 36503, as the numbers on it, down to the bar when the fishing vessel called and said he had a broken oil line and he's adrift at the whistle buoy, but being drifted across the bar towards the north jetty. I immediately radioed that I would take the call and take him in tow, and I started across the bar. The 36-footers had the AM radios in them, but they were in a watertight box that snapped down, but they were tube radio old time, and as the boat jiggled around, the tubes would get loose or come apart, and you would lose all contact. So as I crossed the bar, which was running 15 to 20 feet high and big swells up and down when I go, the radio would come on and off frequently, and so we didn't have complete communications all the time. When I got to the boat, which was easy to find because he had his big lights on, and we got to him, and we threw him the towing hawser. Now I only had one man with me because we're short-handed at the station. We only had approximately 16 to 18 people at the station, and over half of them were gone. And so Vanderhoof only had one person with him, a seaman, and him, and I was a second-class bosun mate, and I had my engineer, Ray Miller, with me, and so we only had just the two of us as a full crew on the lifeboat, when we usually have a minimum of 3. When we got to the fishing vessel, the Uyak was almost 60 foot long, a big, heavy, old-time wooden boat, what we called a big slab, and he had a full load of crabs, so it was very heavy, and he had his man on the forward deck, so we came up, and I never used a heaving line, where that's a small line you tie to your hawser, and then you throw the heaving line, which has a little end of it called a monkey fish with a piece of lead in it, so it would sail through the air to the boat. But then you have to pull in the small line and then the big line. So I would get close enough that we could just throw in the big line, which was the hawser, and was about 3 inches in diameter across there, big old manila hawser, and we carried 900 feet on board the vessel, and it was stacked across the back of the vessel where the coxswains and the crewmen would stand. It was underneath the catwalks, because coming down from the side, the catwalks were even with the gunnels, and then it dropped down into the well decks that I described earlier. So we passed him over the tow line, and he made it fast, and I had to play out the line. Now the seas are pretty rough. We're rolling from gunnel to gunnel, back and forth, and we were up and down, and it's pretty precarious working with there, and you have to watch it. Don't get the line in the screw. You're drifting around and playing out line. So we did this, and we got him in tow, and I started in, and about that time the radio came on, and it was the CO, Mr. Lawrence, Warrant Officer W4, called us, and he says, do not bring the vessel in at this time. The bar is starting to break clear across, and it would be too dangerous to try to tow him across the bar at this time. Remain out to sea. I says, oh, wow. So I made a big turn, and the fishing boat heard it, and he says, roger on that. So I made a big, long turn to keep the hawser still taut, but still out there. And we probably had him about 700 to 800 feet behind us by the time we got all the line out, and then made fast to our Samson posts that are back aft, just aft. So there's about 3.5 feet from the Samson post to the stern of the boat. And when I turned around, I started heading southwest into the storm, and I said, it's going to be a miserable, long, cold, wet night. And we didn't have the gear they have now. We had just our regular chambray shirts with a fall weather jacket, and our pants, denim pants, and cotton. So we were already soaking wet from the spray and that coming across, and the waves that would hit the forward forecastle and splash up, hit the spray shield, then come down over the top of you. And so we were very miserable. And Miller started getting seasick. Most people, even our crews, and the boat rolling and rolling back and forth and pitching in it, got seasick. I was one of the very fortunate people. I did not get seasick, so I could maintain my strength and that better than they. And they would lay down in the well deck, and water would run across them, and they would be heaving in that and so sick that they didn't care about the water running across. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a long, long night. And they called and they said, we're going to get the cutter, the 125-foot cutter out of Coos Bay, to come up and relieve you of the tow later. Well, it was approximately 100 miles down to Coos Bay. I think it was in a straight line, 86, but then you got to go up the river 8 miles, and that, so the cutter is on a 2-hour standby, so they wouldn't even get in our way for at least 2.5 hours, and then it take them an hour or so to get down to the bar, and they're not going to get up here until daylight in the morning. But at least they were underway, or going to get underway. And so I got the boat and I'm heading southwest. So I said, so okay, I started slowing the boat down, the 36-footer. So I would just have a very slow tow and keep the hawser tight behind us. And I would go into the swells and up and down and like that and keep the cantilever in the line. So he would ride better and we would ride, we wouldn't slam. And we did this once and I turned around and started back towards the bar, and I figured I'd go 2 hours into it and an hour back because we come back much faster with the storm. And I would do this all night long. And I'm going to be stuck on the wheel because Miller couldn't relieve me too much because he was too seasick and couldn't follow the compass. The 36-footer has two little running lights, red and green. It has a bow light that folds up and locks into place or down. I had it down because by working with the boat and taking sea spray, when it would come up, it would all blind you in a big white flash. So I lowered the bow light. The stern light was just a very small little white light, so very, very hard to identify out to sea or to sea, and particularly seas we were in. And all of a sudden, as I'm coming back in, on my second turn coming back, the engine went and came to a dead stop. And I knew the sound. I knew what it was. We had the hawser in the screw. And I said, how could this happen? How could this happen that we got the hawser in the screw? And I reached over on the radio and I hit the radio to make sure that it would run, and the fishing boat was on the radio saying, Coast Guard, I got my engine started. I fixed the oil line. I'm all right. I can proceed to sea on my own. And I says, no. I said, we have the hawser in the screw. And what happened was he got his engine started and he put it in gear to test it. And when he put it in gear, I had already turned and started back out to sea. And so the hawser had a big dip in it. And when he went ahead, that dip got bigger. And we went up the swell and came back down and sat right on the hawser. And of course it wraps up in the screw, and we were single screw, so we only had the one. And that big hawser in there was enough wrapping around and put enough tension on the engine that it killed the engine. So we were dead in the water. And I says, we have the hawser in the screw, we're dead in the water. And he said, I will tow you out to sea. I will tow you back out to sea. I said, no, you cannot do this. The hawser's around the screw. If you tow us, you'll tear the screw off and they tear the shaft out of the boat and you put us in a sinking condition. I said, throw the hawser off of your vessel, proceed to sea, because I'm still responsible for you because I had you in tow. I said, and proceed out to past the whistle buoy and the other lifeboat will come and get us. And they were listening on the radio, and 514 with Van Hoof says, Roger, we'll come out to you. We see where your position is. Well, the bow light was still down, so that wasn't shining, and we had the two little red and green lights, port and starboard, and the little stern light, but in those heavy seas, and we were drifting, and he went out, straight on out, and we went towards the North Reef, and he didn't get to us, and I called him, and I said, we are heading for the North Reef, we're heading for the North Reef, and I said, he says, we can't see you, and I said, well, I'll get, now put up the bow light, that'll help. Maybe the spray and the white flash, you'll see us. And so I went out and I put the bow light on and I said, I got to anchor. I got to throw out the anchor. We're drifting too fast, and these big seas in that reef is breaking 25 to 30 feet high, and it'll just smash us to pieces. So we had two anchors on board, a 55-pounder and a 100-pounder. And I said, I cannot handle the 100-pound anchor with the boat twisting back and forth and rolling and pitching. And then I said, I'll end up on the deck with a 100-pound anchor crushing me. So I went to the ready box. In the first well deck, there's two little boxes on the side, and they were approximately 4 to 5 foot long, and lifted up the hatch, and I grabbed the anchor out of there, and it's a folding anchor. It unfolds and has pins, and I made sure I got the pins in and locked the pins down, and I got the 55-pounder all ready to go. And there was 300 feet of anchor line for it, and I made that fast, no chain, and I made it fast over a round turn and there, and an extra bowline on it, so I knew it was not going to come loose. And I grabbed it and I put my arms, and I got up on the catwalk, and I got my knees on the catwalk, which is even with the gunnels of the boat, and they have lifelines there, and I up with the 55-pound anchor, and I threw it over the lifelines, and down it went. And it went out, and finally it hit bottom, and we were only in probably 60 feet of water at that time, and I up on the forecastle, and the forecastle is kind of rounded off and has two little handrails, sticks up about that high. And so I have the line in one hand, and I'm on my hands and knees, because now I'm up there. If the boat takes a heavy roll, I could slide right off the forecastle very easy. So I crawl up, and I am in the bow, there's a round hole like this, and it's down about 3.5 feet. It has two little scuppers at the bottom, so if it fills full of water, the water will drain out, and you stand in it when you're handling lines and that, so you won't be washed overboard. And I made it to the glory hole, which we call the glory hole. That's where you got your first glorious ride in a lifeboat. And I jumped in the glory hole, and I still had the line tight, and I made it fast around the Samson post, and then I played out the rest of it until I had about, maybe 15, 20 feet left, and I made it fast. And the anchor is dragging on the bottom and dragging, and we're slowing our drift down, and pretty soon the anchor comes tight and the line came tight and the boat stopped and I was just outside the reef, just 100, 200 yards outside the reef when I called Vanderhoof on the radio, and I says, we're just outside the North Reef, I'll put up a flare. And he says, no, I got you. I just got a spot of your light, you won't need to do that. And he came on up alongside of us, and he headed into the seas, and he threw me the heaving line. And so I grabbed the heaving line, and I had to get out of the glory hole and crawl across the forecastle, grab the heaving line, crawl back, jump in the glory hole, and then I pulled in the heaving line as fast as I could, and attached to that was his 3-inch hawser, and I got it, and I pulled it up, and I pulled it up, and I pulled it up, and I made it fast to one of the Samson posts, and now I had to get the anchor. And I pulled, and I pulled, and I pulled, and I pulled. I did not want to cut the line because I might need the anchor later. And besides, it's government property, and I didn't want to lose it. And so I pulled, and then once it got to what we call short stay, that's straight up and down, now I had to pull the 55-pound anchor up. Then I had to crawl back across the forecastle, holding that line to the catwalk so I could get it up over there, and I'd throw it in the well deck. So now there's 300 feet of line and the anchor laying in the forward well deck. And I told Vanderhoof, go. And he took us in tow, and we started on out to sea. And in the meantime, one of the fishing boats, big one, had crossed the bar, and he says, there's huge swells on the bar, but no breaks. Huge swells on the bar, but no breaks. So Vanderhoof says, I'm going to tow him on in, because we could take a breaker as long as we don't get underneath the curl. And he started out to the whistle buoy, made his approach, and started in. And there's 2 range lights in the inside there. He got them lined up. You could see every minute and a half to 2 minutes, you'd rise up on the swell and you could see the range lights, and that you knew the course in anyway. And so he's on there, and we get just about what we call the middle of the bar. The bar would run from the end of the jetties out maybe a half mile, and we were just about in the middle of it, and we got picked up and we started to surf. And I said, oh my God, we got a breaker. And she started breaking, and it broke underneath us, and we traveled on it, and we dropped down the backside, and the breaker went up and it hit the Vanderhoof's boat, and that 3-inch manila hawser broke, just like that, just like store twine. There's tremendous power in those breakers. And you got his 36-footer, 10 1/4 tons, mine 10 1/4 tons, pulling on that hawser, and it broke. And I ran to the radio, and I said, the hawser broke, we're going adrift. And at that time, the jetties, as I explained, were only half as long as they are now. And at the end of the jetty was a can buoy. That's a big buoy, and it's black. It was black on there, but no lights on it. And it's right off the end of the jetty. And I looked up, and there's the can buoy coming right at us. I said, oh my God. And we rose up in the air, and we came back down, and we hit the can buoy, and it took a chunk out of the gunnel and went down, and Vanderhoof had turned around and was coming back, and his seaman threw me the hawser, and no heaving line this time. We didn't have time, and he got close enough he could throw me the hawser, and I grabbed it. Well, I'm pulling our end of the hawser in, and I hadn't had it all the way in yet, and he threw me his, and I'm standing in that glory hole, and I put a bite in the line, and I ran the line up around, and I made it fast
knot into it. And I said, gee, I hope it holds, I hope it holds. And he went out and he pulled, and he just kept going, the line came tight, and boom, the knot came tight, and it held. And he told me back out to sea. And so he's holding the boat out there, and they said, well, we need another lifeboat to come up and relieve you of the tow, because the tow on hawser is broke and it's frayed, and you only have part of it, and the other part's on this boat, so we need another. So they called Depot Bay, and they said, we need to have you come down and relieve the 36-footer of the tow, and you have a good towing hawser. And so the Depot Bay at that time only had about 6 people total at the station. And of course, New Year's Eve, they only had 2 men at the station. So they used to use the fire department. So they called the fire department and they said, we need an extra man if you can spare it. And they blew the whistle. But of course, New Year's Eve, nobody came. And finally, one fireman showed up at the station and they said, okay, fine, let's go. So they went, so they had 3 men on board, the coxswain and the fireman and the seaman. But the fireman immediately got seasick, so he wasn't too much used to them, and they ran down. And during the interim, the wind was changing around from the southwest. It was slowly blowing around to the west and come around to the northwest. So as they took off, they kind of had a following sea going, and they made good time down. And it's approximately 12 miles from our whistle buoy down to their whistle buoy, and they can do 10 knots. So just over an hour and a half, they were on scene. And all this time, we're being told we're just washing, just back and forth, washing back and forth. And poor Miller was getting sicker all the time and heaving up and getting the dry heaves. And I said, oh, poor guy. And we both had life jackets on. And they were the old Kapok heavy World War II life jackets, and they were heavy in that, and I liked them because they had that so much padding in there, it was like extra warmth around you, and it would take up the bruises when you would slam into a bulkhead or the side of the boat or into the forward compartment. It would take up the bruises and that on you, so I liked it real well. And Miller had taken his off because they'd heaved on it, and he was laying on the well deck and his life jacket was wet. And I said, I don't like this situation. So I picked up his life jacket and gave it a shake, and I put it around him. We had leg straps that went around you. And I took the leg straps and I tied them around him in big square knots across his chest there. And he said, I don't really need this. I said, yes, you do. And I tied the second one really tight. And so now we're still just waiting for the 36-footer from Depot Bay, and finally it got on scene, and they had what they call a heaving stick, and it's a piece of bamboo about this long with a chunk of lead welded to the end of it, about the size of your fist, and you can throw them a long way, but you got to be careful you don't catch it, and if you do, you're going to be hurting. And I'm standing in the glory hole, and he comes up alongside and they throw me the stick, and it went across the forecastle, so I had to get out of the glory hole and reach over and grab it and then jump back to the glory hole, and I pull in, and here comes the hawser, and I get the hawser on up, and we had already thrown Vanderhoof's line off, and just as when they got there, so now I'm free, and I make the line fast around the Samson post and said, we're all ready to go. And he said, Roger, and he started out by the whistle buoy. He got us lined up on the ranges, and another fishing boat, big one, he crossed in and he says, oh, the bars calm down, use swells, no breaks at this time. Well, breakers come in series, and one time there'll be a lot of breakers, then they come down, calm down for a while, and then come back up. And he must have just hit it perfect in between swells. So they started towing us back in. He said, well, okay, we'll tow him on in. And I said, I don't like this. So I went up forward, and then that forecastle, there was one hatch, square hatch, and it's just about like that, just enough to duck down and get inside. Inside, you can't quite stand up in the forecastle, but there's 2 long benches in there, and you have all kinds of survival gear tied to them, and fire extinguishers and axes and different things like that you need. And so I went up there into the forecastle, and I grabbed the sea anchor, the drogue, and has an opening about this long, and it's about this long, and it's tapered down to the end, and it has lines coming off of it, so when you throw it overboard, it acts as a drag or a drogue behind you, and it has another tripping line tied to the end of it, and I just cut the tripping line off. I didn't want a bunch of extra lines while we're going in, and I wasn't about to trip it and reset it and trip it and reset it by myself. It takes a couple of people to do that. So I just made one setting, set the thing about 50 feet behind the boat, locked it down to the after Samson post, and said, we're ready to go. And they started in. We were about halfway across, and all of a sudden our boat picked up and picked up and picked up in the air, and we were way at the top of this, and that breaker broke and drove us down until the bow dug into the wave ahead of us to the trough, and the drogue was doing its job. It held us back there and stopped us from capsizing and rolling on over, and the breaker then broke and then rolled and hit the other lifeboat, Depot Bay's lifeboat, and hit it, and that hawser broke. Depot Bay crew were not used to our bar and the happenings and going on, and they did not realize, because they took the break and they were soaking wet, and their well deck was full of water, and they had other things they were thinking about, and they hadn't realized that the hawser had broke, and they just kept on going, and here we are now adrift. And I said, oh my God. I ran over, crawled back across the forecastle, down the catwalk, to the radio, unbuckled it, beat on the radio, and I grabbed it and I said, this is, and we had call letters for the boat. And I said, this is Nan William Easy Obo. That was our call letter. And I said, this is Nan William Easy Obo. I said it 3 times. The towing hawser is broke. We're going on the South Reef. We're going on the South Reef. And then I put it down. I said, here, Miller. And I broke out the searchlight, 12-volt searchlight, and we plugged it into the bulkhead, and it came on. I said, you hold the searchlight, search it around like this, and I'm going back in the glory hole to take the line. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And here comes Vanderhoof's boat. He had heard the call, and he was closer, and he's coming towards us. But they had the line, his towing hawser, what was left of it, remember, it had broken and tied it into 2, and then we passed it all to him. So he's got a well deck full of line with knots in it and frayed there, and they're trying to cut the line and get a good end. And he said, we'll be back. And he went out by us. I thought, oh my God. And I looked off the side, and now it's pitch black. It's probably, I don't know, 10:30, 11 o'clock, 2300 in the evening. And I thought, oh my God. And I seen this big break, and on the outer station reefs, they break 30 feet high, and we were being drifted right into it. And I said, oh my God. So I said, I'm going to go back up forward, and the Depot Bay boat will surely be coming. And Depot Bay boat came, and they were meticulously making the line up, and in the stern of the boat, where we kept the hawser, was a towing reel. And they had the towing reel, and they were meticulously making it up on the towing reel rather than pulling it in and getting it. And he said, we're not ready. And they went on by us. And I thought, oh my God. And Vanderhoof now had turned and was coming back. And we're sitting there, and then that big swell came up, and we got on the swell, and we started racing down the swell, and the drogue did its job. It opened up, and it held us on back, and the breaker went on by us and broke just ahead of us. But Vanderhoof got the same break behind, and he came by. I thought, he's going to ram us, he's going to ram us. And he was just heading right straight for us. And the drogue came taut and held us back, and he misses. If I had been quick enough, I could have jumped from my boat to his boat. It was that close. But you can imagine rising and falling 15, 20 feet, and that, it would have been a pretty dangerous job. And I didn't think of it at the time. I still wanted to stay with my boat. And he went off, he took a break and rolled up until he was 90 degrees over, going with the break, and then disappeared into the white water and into the darkness. And they had what we call the battle lantern. They held them, and there were lanterns like this, and with batteries in them. And they had that, and the seaman had it in his hand. And when the boat went over, of course, he held on, and the lantern is sinking in the sea. And I could see it in the breaker, and the white foam going down like this. I thought, God, they sank. They sank, and then I heard the engine, room, room, and he had a 471 Jimmy diesel engine in it, and I could hear it sputtering and going, and he's working his way out to sea. I said, well, they're going. Everything must be all right. He's heading for sea, but he's in trouble. And I thought, okay, I'm in the glory hole now, and I looked up, and here it comes. Here comes this huge, huge breaker. It's coming down, and it's going to get us. And we started running, the drogue held, and we turned broadside, and the breaker came down on his broadside, and from stem to stern, and I ducked down in the glory hole. Of course, it filled full of water, and we rolled up and over until we were upside down, and we were going upside down and like that. And I'm holding my breath, and I'm holding my breath, and I'm holding my breath. And I thought, oh my God, what if we sink and we're upside down and I'm in the glory hole? If I stick my head out, I'm going to stick it right in the sand. And these are the thoughts that go through you when you're in trouble or things are going bad. And I thought, I got to stand up. I'm running out of air. And I stuck up my head up out of the glory hole, and we're right side up. And the anchor line that I had thrown in the well deck was all wrapped around us and that, and hanging over the side. And I came out of the glory hole, and I threw up the anchor back up into the well deck so it wouldn't smash us. And the searchlight is gone, and Miller's gone. And I'm saying, oh my God, he's gone. And I crawled across down the catwalk and to the after, and now it's total pitch black. And after a breaker breaks on you, everything gets kind of quiet. Dead silence, and everything was dead silence and pitch black. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and I knew the next series was about to come within a minute, and I'm yelling, Miller, Miller, Miller. No answer, and I yell out louder, Miller, and I heard, Mac, Mac. And he's pretty close to the boat, and Miller, and then I'd seen something in the water, and it's Miller, and he's coming back, and he's got a line in his hand. Miller had been thrown 50 feet out of the boat, tumbled through the air, hit the water, and he told me later, he says, I knew I was going to drown because I took my life jacket off, and I came to the surface, and you had tied it on to me, and it was up around my neck, but it was floating me, and I reached out, and there was the drogue. And he grabbed the drogue line, and he's pulling himself back on the drogue line, and now it's almost 3 feet on the water up to the gunnel, and Miller was small, 145 pounds, I was about the same weight, but the two of us, and when you're in a position like that, you just have extra strength. And I grabbed Miller, and I pulled him up, and we got him into the well deck there by the coxswain's flat. And I says, they're not coming back, and we're adrift. I said, I hope we hit the beach, but we might hit the jetty. But I said, we might roll over again and not be as fortunate. Come on. And we crawled up the catwalk. When I opened up the hatch into the forecastle, opened up the hatch, and we both got inside, and there's a little 12-volt bulb in there, and it was on, and very, very kind of eerie there, and the extra life jackets were around. I said, take life jackets and start wrapping them around you, because if we roll again, we need some padding. And he said, okay, and we both put an extra life jacket around us, and we grabbed one, and I was just going to put one around my head, and the boat went up on its side, and I said, oh my God, and we're hanging, and we grabbed the little handholds, and the boat went up, and over it went again, and boom, something hit me on the head. Bang, I went down on my knees. I was probably on my knees already, but that's what I remember. I'm on my knees now, and I grabbed my head, and my hand was full of blood, and I turned to Miller, I said, what did you hit me for? He said, I didn't hit you. He said, but you sure are bleeding. And I said, oh God. Oh well, I said, it didn't knock me out anyway, and you bleed so profusely when you get scuffed in the head anyway, and so I figured, well, I'm in pretty good shape. It didn't knock me out, we're fine, and so I said, well, we got to get this gear out of here, and I went to open up the hatch to throw out the fire extinguisher. I got tore off the bulkhead when we went upside down. There was a bracket there, and it came loose from the bracket and hit me on the head, and that's what did the damage. And I opened up the hatch, and I opened it up about, maybe an inch and a half, and it jammed. And it jammed. We were locked inside. And I said, if we hit the jetty, because I didn't know where we were going to end up on the beach or on the jetty, if we hit the jetty and the rocks start coming through here, we'll drown in here. There's no way out. And so I said, boom, I'm hitting it. Something's got that hatch there. Well, outside, unbeknownst to anybody, because it never happened before, the ready box where I took the anchor out was sitting outside the hatch. And nobody had ever thought about it, but if the ready box was not all the way open or all the way closed, but part way open, the lid of it would stop the hatch from opening. And that's what had happened. The gear had came out of it after I didn't latch it back down, and some of the gear had came out and was hanging out there, so the ready box was half open, and it was up like this, and the hatch. And so I reached over and I grabbed the very pistol and I stuck it through the little opening I had, and Miller saying, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." And I said, "I'm not going to shoot. I'm going to push down, and you get over here and put your shoulder against it." And we worked. I don't know how long we worked. It seemed like forever, but we finally got the right combination. I got down on the lid and he hit it, and the hatch flew open. And I went outside, and there was lying in the well deck, and the axe that I'd thrown out had stuck underneath into one of the scuppers. And I picked up the axe and I started chopping the end of the ready box like this. I wanted to chop the corner off, and of course rolling around and back and forth and back and forth. I hit the bulkhead once in a while, almost chopped through the watertight bulkhead, but I got the end of the box chopped off, and the hatch would open up and down no matter if the ready box was, well, then I closed it and latched it, but a little too late, but at least the end of it was off. It couldn't happen again. And I dove back inside and we locked down, and we're there and we're talking. I don't know, we talk about all kinds of different things and that. And of course, my wife was home and pregnant with our second daughter, and it was going to be born here and so it's about halfway through pregnancy. So I talked about that, and of course Miller had kids, and so we talked about our families that, and I said, "I don't think we're going to hit the jetty. It's been too long. If we hit the beach and hit the sand," I said, "it'll be a kind of a soft bump." And going through the surf, boom, we're on our side, we're on the back, we're back and forth, we're over, we got these life jackets packed around us, and we're really getting the heck beat out of us. And all of a sudden, boom, boom. I said, "It's sand." And Miller said, "Let's get out of here." I said, No, let's stay put." I said, "Let's wait until it's wet." I said, "There's what we call crab pot holes along the ocean, and sometimes you can hit a shoal and you'll be here, but you might have a 6-foot deep hole ahead of you that you have to swim through." I said, "Let's wait until we're way up on the beach, they're nice and tight, so we can jump overboard." He said, "Okay." And finally, a few minutes, the boat seemed to be well set and not being thrust around much anymore. So I opened up the hatch. We both came out, and I secured the hatch. And we stood there. I said, "Can you swim good?" And he said, No, I just barely made it through boot camp. I'm not a good swimmer at all, and I'm really weak because you've been heaving and seasick." I said, "Okay, here's the thing. You jump overboard first, and I'll come after you. That way I can grab you. If I go first, I might lose you." So I said, "You go first, and I'll jump after you and grab you if it's deep water." And I was waiting. I said, "Wait until I tell you." And I got I could see it was still pitch black out, but the waves would wash up and it come down. I could see through the foam that it's not very deep at all. But Miller, he wasn't thinking, of course not. And he jumps off the boat kind of in a swan dive and lands on his belly, but he had a life jacket on. Kind of knocked the wind out of him, and he went, "Whoa!" And I jumped right after him, grabbed him, and he said, "Oh." I said, "Yeah, it's only that deep." And we grabbed him, and up the beach we went, and the sirens went off. And it was New Year's Eve, 1954. And I said, "Well, they're welcoming us on the beach." And we sat there and soaking wet, cold, and I'm wet and I'm bloody all over the place, and that had to stop bleeding. And water and blood together makes really a mess. And I looked up, and down the beach, I could see the lights coming, and it was our truck from the station. It was called an Oshkosh because it was built in Oshkosh, Michigan, I think it is. And a 10-wheel drive, big truck. And in those days, there were thousands of logs along the beach, and they came down clear up there by the old Coast Guard station back in the 1800s, and came through a little road and on the beach over logs. And the crew said he just bumped the logs out of the way, and Garrett said, "We got to get to them," because they could see the little running lights from the boat on the beach. And I didn't turn them off. Everything else was off and secured, but the running lights were still on. And he came down and he stopped. Mr. Lawrence was driving the truck, and he says, "You okay?" And he said, "Just the two of you?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Oh," he says, "How you feel?" I said, I feel great now." He said, "Okay, go and get in the truck." And we got in the truck, and there were 2 or 3 people with them. They were in the back, and we drove back to the station. And we got back to the station. You come in the back door, and there's a few steps to go up and into the mess deck at that time. And we got in the mess deck, and the 2 crews, the one from Depot Bay and Venaho's crew, were sitting there, and there was a few other people New Year's Eve. They'd all heard the call, and some of the fishermen came to, when they heard that we were going, they were going to go search for us on the beach. So the mess deck was pretty full of people, and I was kind of, what was it, a little brazen when I say, I didn't like the idea that they left us and didn't come back after there, and I was going to really chew some tail. And the skipper says, "Just a moment before you say anything." And how about a nice hot cup of coffee? And yeah, he usually use sugar in the coffee. And he poured it out straight out, and he says, "Here." And there was a bottle of whiskey sitting on the counter and the table. Somebody had brought it in. First time I ever seen booze on the Coast Guard station. And he grabbed that, and he put half coffee and half whiskey into it to Miller and I, and he said, "Here, drink this." Well, by the time we drank it, I didn't feel like saying anything. And they called old Dr. Barker, who was our local doctor, and he disrupted his little party where he was for New Year's Eve. He came right to the station, came down there, and he looked at me, and he checked my head over, and he said, "No, you don't need stitches. You just got a nice scrape on the top of the head." He said, "You'll be fine." He said, "Here," and he put something on it. He put a nice little bandage on it, and he said, "You'll be great shape." Well, hypothermia had set in. I was cold, and Miller was cold. And the old man said, "Okay, get up in the shower and get warmed up." And so we went up in the shower. When in the shower, of course, the bandage came off my head. I got all warmed up, and I called the wife and told her we were fine, and I'll be home very shortly. Got me a set of dry clothes, and so the crew said, "Well, you're still bleeding now that you had the shower, and that we'll take care of you." And they took one of those World War II bandages, a big tripod bandage, and they folded it up and they stuck it across my head, and they tied it underneath there and around the neck, and I looked like I had just been through the war zone. And they said, "Okay," and I said, "All right." So I just drove home, and of course the wife was up waiting for me, and when I got to the door, she opened the door and said, "Oh my God, what happened?" I said, "Oh," I said, "the guys put an extra big bandage on. I got a little scrape on the head." And she says, "Oh, okay, you don't look very good." I said, "Well, I feel great." And so I got a fairly good night's sleep. Got up, woke up early in the morning, and I took our car and I drove right to the station, and he says, "No, the skipper has been up for hours. He's got a cat, and they're down on the beach." And I went drove down the road to the old Coast Guard station, and they got there, and here's the boat on the beach, and they got the cat, and we were getting logs. And so we worked all day long. We got 2 big logs, and we dug them in the sand, and put cross pieces across there, skidded the boat up on there onto the logs, and then locked it down, and they towed it up into the sand dunes. And after the storm, 3 days later, we got a lowboy down there, and they skid up in the lowboy, and we took it over to the terminal docks, where at that time there was a huge big mill there, and they had a 75-ton crane. Well, the boat only weighed 10.25 tons, and the logs and things probably weighed 3 or 4 more tons. So they picked the boat, the logs and everything up, put it down into the water, released it. We pulled out the logs, and the skipper says, and at that time, the line and the screw had been removed and gone and everything. He says, "There it is. You took it up from the station, you take it back." So I got in the station, and Miller, he said, "The 2 of you," and we got in the boat, and I hit the starter. It started right up, and we ran the boat back to the station. And for less than $1,000, we cracked a plank, putting it on the logs, and they had to renew the top of the engine room. It broke every beam in the top of the engine room, and the sheet of plywood that went across the top, and that had to be renewed, and a few other things where the gunwale had been tore up. But for less than $1,000, the boat was all fixed up and ran for years and years afterwards, and is now sitting on the lawn in front of the station, the 36503 Nan William Easy Oval.